When you really sit down and think about it, the standard explanation for why Hitler launched the Second World War just doesn't add up. The story goes that he was some kind of lunatic who dreamed of world domination, or perhaps he wanted to turn Eastern Europe into one massive agricultural zone because he thought Germans should become farmers. The reasoning given is that Germany suffered from British naval blockades during the First World War, which led to widespread hunger, so Hitler wanted to prevent that scenario from repeating itself. But here's the thing that never made sense to me. If you're worried about food shortages, why not simply avoid war altogether and continue trading for what you need? Germany has managed to stay out of major European conflicts since 1945, so why couldn't they have just maintained peaceful trade relationships to secure their food supply? You don't have to violently seize the resources and food you require when you can simply purchase them through normal commercial channels. The typical response to this question is that Hitler didn't want Germany to be dependent on other powers, so he needed to acquire territory and resources to achieve complete self-sufficiency. This would supposedly help him win the inevitable next war that he was planning. But think about the circular logic here. He doesn't possess the land and resources necessary to win a war, so he starts a war to obtain those land and resources, and then proceeds to lose that war precisely because he lacks the land and resources. He needed to win it in the first place. He initiated the conflict to get the very things he needed to succeed in the conflict. It's a logical loop that makes absolutely no sense. Then historians will tell you that he simply wanted to conquer Eastern territories because of his hatred for Jews and Marxists, as if that alone would be sufficient motivation for millions of Germans to support him. Sure, there was significant anti-Semitism and anti-Marxist sentiment in Germany. But would people really march to war just to destroy these groups? And yes, the Soviet Union existed in the East, and in Hitler's worldview, it represented Judeo-Bolshevism. But why attack so prematurely when Germany was clearly unprepared? Consider that out of 142 German divisions that invaded the Soviet Union, only a small handful were actually motorized or armored divisions. Wouldn't it have made more strategic sense to wait until more units were mechanized or until they had accumulated more tanks? Once again, there are significant gaps in the reasoning. People often say that Hitler was planning for war and therefore had to establish a war economy beforehand. Fair enough, but he went to war in 1939 while establishing his war economy back. In 1933, that's 6 full years of operating on a war footing before any actual fighting began. Does that really make sense? His self-sufficiency program also prevented him from trading for the food and petroleum he desperately needed to build up his military forces and motorize them, which created a severe shortage of trucks and other essential vehicles. This actually worked against his supposed preparation for war. So why not implement the war economy in the late 30s, perhaps in 1938 or 1939, and allow the necessary trade to stockpile food and fuel for the coming conflict? Why start so early? No reasonable explanation is typically provided. This is the point where people throw up their hands and say that Hitler was simply insane, which is why nothing makes logical sense. And I have to completely reject this argument. Hitler was undeniably evil, but you don't go from being a struggling artist to becoming the leader of continental Europe if you're genuinely mad. That simply doesn't happen in the real world. Most people don't rally behind and follow insane individuals. You might believe a particular leader is crazy, but that's usually because you disagree with or don't comprehend their reasoning, not because they're actually clinically insane. So yes, Hitler was evil. But he must have had some coherent logic to convince so many people to follow him. I've demonstrated in numerous previous videos that Hitler wasn't always the madman that German generals later portrayed him to be after the war, so perhaps this is another one of those cases. Clearly, the traditional explanation falls apart under scrutiny. This question about Hitler's true motivations for war has bothered me for quite some time because the standard narrative has never felt right. I've always believed there had to be an actual reason that makes at least some logical sense. Otherwise, why would the German people follow a madman to their destruction? People just don't do that willingly. Well, it turns out there actually is a genuine reason for why Hitler went to war, and it explains all the contradictions I've just outlined. It's not complicated or difficult to grasp. I can explain it to you in detail in just a few minutes, which raises an interesting question. Why isn't this discussed in more history books or taught in schools? I was certainly never taught this. We'll explore that question in depth in a future discussion, but first, let me walk you through Hitler's actual reasoning. Imagine it's 1919. Hitler surveys the world and makes an observation. The Western world has become industrialized while the rest of the world has not. Because the West is industrialized and therefore has large urban populations, it needs more food than it can produce domestically. So currently, the industrialized Western nations trade their manufactured goods to the rest of the world in exchange for food and raw materials. But Hitler sees a problem with this arrangement. If we continue trading industrial goods to these non-industrial nations, they will eventually become industrialized themselves. They'll build their own factories and machine tools and grow their own cities. But if they develop their own cities and manufacture their own industrial products, they won't need our industrial goods anymore, and they won't want to give us their food because they'll need it for their own growing populations. And if they don't need our industrial goods, we won't be able to trade for food. And if we can't get the food we need, the working classes will go hungry. And if the poor go hungry, that will inevitably lead to class warfare, which in Hitler's mind would be exploited by Jews to usher in a Marxist revolution. This is what's known as the shrinking markets concept. There are several variations on the terminology, but I'm using this one. This idea is intimately connected with Hitler's racist ideology, which needs some explanation to understand fully. Hitler believed that when two animals of different species produce offspring, that offspring is inherently inferior. A donkey and a horse create a mule, which cannot reproduce. Hitler interpreted this as nature's way of demonstrating that mixed bloodlines are wrong. Yes, it's pseudoscience that's completely false. Tigers and lions can produce ligers that are fertile. But you get the idea of his flawed reasoning. Hitler then applied this biological misunderstanding to human beings and declared that only pure-blooded Aryans could build nations. He claimed that throughout history, nations didn't rise and fall because of warfare or economic factors, but because of their racial composition. Nations could only rise to greatness through Aryans. In Hitler's twisted worldview, when an Aryan race created a nation, they would conquer other races, then interbreed with their slaves, dilute their blood with that of the inferior peoples they'd conquered, weaken themselves genetically, and cause the inevitable downfall of their civilization. He wrote that a people who fail to preserve the purity of their racial blood thereby destroy the unity of the soul of the nation in all its manifestations. A disintegrated national character becomes the inevitable consequence of disintegration in the blood. Notice how everything revolves around the racial collective, the racial group. Hitler perceived the world entirely in terms of groups and races. In Hitler's hierarchy of races, the worst was the Jewish race, because as he pointed out, they had never established a nation of their own. This was before 1948, when Israel was founded, and the establishment of the State of Israel actually undermines the entire foundation of Nazi ideology, because Hitler's racial theory was built on the premise that non-Aryans couldn't build nations. Yet the Jews did establish a nation. So Hitler was demonstrably wrong. But during Hitler's lifetime, the Jews had not had a nation-state. Hitler therefore described the Jews as a plague that infects nations and races, diluting their blood and bringing about their collapse. He then argued that Jews were the ones promoting this trade with non-industrialized nations because they wanted to create food shortages. These food shortages would result in poor people going hungry. These poor workers would be manipulated by Jews who would instigate class struggle. The Jews, who also created Marxism since Marx was Jewish, would then usher in a Marxist revolution. And once everyone was supposedly equal under Marxism, the Jews would be able to intermarry with Aryans, dilute all the blood, and since only Aryans could create nations in his worldview, this would cause the end of all civilization. So remarkably, Hitler actually believed he was trying to save the world. He genuinely thought he was doing the right thing, but the fundamental flaws in his logic and his complete misunderstanding of how the world actually functioned led him to catastrophically wrong conclusions and down a path that would result in millions of deaths. Looking from the outside, we can clearly see that his observations and conclusions were absolutely flawed, but he couldn't see it himself. This is the real danger of the human condition and the human mind. This represents a crucial lesson from history. We think we're doing the right thing, and yet some of us end up doing terrible things, even though we believed we were righteous. We all have beliefs and think we understand how this world really operates, but is that actually the case? Have we truly listened to alternative arguments and understood where they're coming from? Or are we blinded by our conviction that any alternative to our current thinking must be wrong? You have to open your eyes and examine opposing arguments. If you don't do that, you risk becoming the next Hitler or Stalin. So according to Hitler's thinking, the Jews were supposedly exploiting the shrinking markets problem to bring about class, conflict, then a Marxist revolution, dilute the blood, and bring down civilization. What Hitler decided to do was stop this supposed Jewish conspiracy in its tracks. To accomplish this, he had to solve the class crisis by uniting German workers and the middle class under one nation, a nation built upon race, not the middle class concept of a nation. If we look at America as an example, in America it doesn't matter if you're black or white or any other color, you're still an American citizen. This is because your nationality is more important than your race. For Hitler, the race was the nation itself. So mixing races within a nation was unacceptable in his eyes and represented a middle-class bourgeois concept of nations. He wrote that a people cannot be made national according to the meaning attached to that word by the bourgeois class, that is, nationalism with many reservations, but national in the extreme and passionate sense. This ideology, that race equals nation, meant he had to remove Jews from society to prevent them from diluting the blood or causing more class struggle. And because of the shrinking markets problem, he had to stop trading industrial goods for food immediately. The longer Germany continued trading, the stronger those other countries would become, and the worse the class struggle would be in Germany. His belief in the shrinking markets problem forced him to stop trade with other countries. The shrinking markets problem is why he implemented his self-sufficiency program as soon as he came to power. But Germany didn't have enough agricultural land or petroleum, and had suffered terribly during the First World War because of these deficiencies. This meant Germany couldn't be self-sufficient through domestic policy alone. So in order to become fully self-sufficient, it would need to conquer lands with abundant soil and resources. Hitler looked around Europe and realized that the only viable location with all the land and resources Germany needed was the Soviet Union. So he proposed going east to conquer their living space. The traditional argument claims that Hitler wanted to go to war, therefore he stopped trading and became self-sufficient. No, that's backwards. That's putting the effect before the cause. He had to stop trading first, therefore he had to go to war, 'cause then effect. This is why he implemented his self-sufficiency program as soon as he took power in 1933. Only the state could force the economy to be self-sufficient, so the German state seized control of the economy. Private property rights were abolished as part of the Reichstag fire decree of 1933, and the Nazi Party confiscated factories and businesses. The Nazis viewed private property as conditional on its use, not as a fundamental right. If property wasn't being used to further Nazi goals, it could be nationalized. Professor Junkers of the Junkers airplane factory refused to follow the government's orders in 1934. The Nazis simply took over the plant, compensating Junkers for his loss. This was the context in which other business arrangements were negotiated. A Marxist hiding in Germany wrote in 1939 that the decree of February 1933 nullified the article of the Weimar Constitution that guaranteed private property and restricted interference with private property. The conception of property experienced a fundamental change. The individualistic conception of the state had to give way to the concept that communal welfare precedes individual welfare. In 1933, the Nazi Party walked into businesses, took them over, and if any business owners complained, they lost their enterprises. And you know what the Nazis called this process? Privatization. But it wasn't privatization at all. It was nationalization. In practice, The Reichsbank and the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs had no intention of allowing radical activists or party militants to dictate the course of events. Under the slogan of the strong state, the ministerial bureaucracy fashioned a new national structure of economic regulation. They worked and governed with incredible energy. They really ruled. For the bureaucrats of the ministry, the contrast to the Weimar Republic was stark. Party debates in the Reichstag were silenced. The language of the bureaucracy was rid of the paralyzing formula that something was technically right, but politically impossible. It would be absurd to deny the reality of this shift. Never again was big business to influence the course of government in Germany, as directly as it did between the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and the onset of the Depression in 1929. The Reich's economic administration accumulated unprecedented powers of national economic control. They implemented wage controls, price controls, resource allocation controls, price commissars, currency printing, worker battalions, state land reforms, quotas, a massive bureaucracy, and confiscation of Jewish property. Within a remarkably short time, trade with the rest of the world was reduced to a minimum. All of this caused the German economy to spiral downward, with food shortages and petroleum shortages, among other critical deficiencies. As a result of the massive increase in public expenditure, the finances of the Reich were catastrophic. This forced the Nazi regime to begin annexing territory simply to stave off economic collapse. With Germany's financial situation deteriorating, daily, the Nazi leadership in Berlin was eager to proceed with its annexation of Czechoslovakia and its domestic campaigns against Jews. The state treasury desperately needed more money. Despite various accounting manipulations, the government was barely avoiding bankruptcy. If nothing was done, Germany's financial problems would quickly be exposed. The only hope was to go on the offensive. The self-sufficiency program started the ticking time bomb that forced Hitler into war. It also explains why the Third Reich had such enormous difficulties stockpiling the petroleum they needed before the war began. Because once you cut imports, you stop exports, and vice versa, due to the lack of foreign currency for exchange. This is basic economics. As I mentioned in a previous discussion about oil, the Nazi leadership knew they would run out of petroleum in autumn 1941, which is why they had to launch Operation Barbarossa when they did. If they had waited until the following year, they wouldn't have had any fuel for the tanks. Overall, the shrinking markets problem forced Hitler to implement self-sufficiency, which in turn forced the Third Reich to go to war to obtain the resources and money needed to survive. And because of this, they ran out of oil and food in late 1941, causing them to lose the war. Many people have claimed that Hitler wanted to deindustrialize and create one giant farm in the East. No, that's a misunderstanding of Hitler's proposal. Hitler believed economics was a zero-sum game. He believed that if a nation was industrialized, it wouldn't have enough food for itself, because apparently you can't do both simultaneously. Therefore, what he wanted was German farms in the East with Slavic slaves working the land for their German masters, dotted with German cities and connected by highways. But he didn't want factories in the East. Why? Because the East would trade food for industrial goods from the industrialized German heartland. Germany itself would remain industrialized and ship its manufactured goods to the East, and in return receive the food from the East needed to prevent class struggle. Germany would remain industrialized, the East would be agricultural, and overall the Reich would be self-sufficient and not suffer from shrinking markets. This also explains many other events during the war. Germany didn't have enough agricultural capacity to feed itself, let alone the 3 million Soviet prisoners of war captured in 1941. By 1942, 1.5 million of them were deliberately starved to death. In 1942, the Greek island of Syros sent a desperate message to Athens that read, "Either send us wheat or coffins." Why? Because the Germans had confiscated all the food and sent it back to the Reich. Out of 17,000 people, some argue that up to 8,000 Greeks starved to death on that island. Food was confiscated from Ukraine, from Holland later in the war, and they shipped many civilians from Eastern Europe, including many from Stalingrad, to slave labor camps in the Reich. Many died during transport, and once there, most of the rest were worked to death on starvation rations. As Hitler made crystal clear, everyone else in Europe would starve before a single German would go hungry. But there's more to this story. The shrinking markets concept leads to self-sufficiency, which leads to war, which then goes catastrophically for Germany. The food crisis in 1941 and 1942 becomes severe, and there are all these Jews housed in concentration camps across Europe. The Germans begin thinking that it doesn't make sense to house these Jews and keep feeding them. They're not productive. They're a burden on the economy. And they removed the Jews from society in the first place because they didn't want them to cause class conflict or interbreed and dilute the blood. So what should they do with them? This appears to be a major problem. Now, what exactly becomes the final solution to that problem? Yes, the shrinking markets problem leads to self-sufficiency, which leads to war, which goes badly for Germany, which leads to the death camps of the final solution. Obviously, that's not the only reason, but it's a massive incentive and helps explain the timing of events. It also explains why it happens in the first place. Hitler believed the Jews were bringing in capitalism, which he described as international Jewish finance, in order to trade with non-industrial nations and cause the shrinking markets. This would bring about class conflict, which the Jews would exploit, bringing in their Marxist utopia. Hitler thought the Jews invented both Marxism and capitalism and wanted to bring about the fall of civilization. So Hitler wanted to stop that from happening by halting trade with foreign powers, but also by removing Jews from society. It's all interconnected in a logical but profoundly evil fashion. He wrote that the nationalization of the masses can be successfully achieved only if, in the positive struggle to win the soul of the people, those who spread the international poison among them are exterminated. The international poison meant the Jews, and this is Hitler stating quite clearly that he wanted to exterminate them. He wanted to do this to bring about his utopian racial society, which he envisioned would be a nationalized community of Aryans. Since the racial group was the most important element, the freedom of the individual had to be subjected to the racial group. And since capitalism is the idea that the private individual should control their own economic destiny, it was counter to the idea of a racial community or this nationalization of the masses. Again, it's linked with Hitler's hatred of the international poison. Now that we've discussed this concept, here's a quote from Hitler's second book, where he speaks of the danger if he doesn't pursue his solution to the shrinking markets problem. He wrote that the present world commodity market is not unlimited. The number of industrially active nations has steadily increased. Almost all European nations suffer from an inadequate and unsatisfactory relation between soil and population. Hence, they are dependent on world export. In recent years, the American Union has turned to export, as has Japan in the East. Thus, a struggle automatically begins for the limited markets, which becomes tougher the more numerous the industrial nations become, and conversely, the more the markets shrink. While on one hand, the number of nations struggling for the world market increases, the commodity market itself slowly diminishes, partly in consequence of a process of self-industrialization on their own power, partly through a system of branch enterprises that are more and more coming into being in such countries, out of sheer capitalistic interest. The more purely capitalistic interests begin to determine the present economy, the more the viewpoints of the financial world and the stock exchange achieve decisive influence, the more will this system of branch establishments reach out and, thus, artificially carry out the industrialization of former commodity markets, and especially curtail the export possibilities of the European mother countries. Today, many can still afford to smile over this future development, but as it makes further strides, within 30 years people in Europe will groan under its consequences. The more market difficulties increase, the more bitterly will the struggle for the remaining ones be waged. Although the primary weapons of this struggle lie in pricing and in the quality of goods with which nations competitively try to undersell each other, in the end, the ultimate weapons, even here, lie in the sword. So in Hitler's view, capitalism was dying because of shrinking markets, which would lead to class conflict, which would result in Marxism and the supposed tyranny of the Jews. But wait a moment, why haven't we heard more about this? Why aren't more historians discussing this concept? It's not like it's a complicated idea to understand. Well, some historians do discuss it. There are books that explore the ins and outs of National Socialist ideology in great detail, and it was from these sources that I was made aware of this concept. These books can be hard to obtain, but if you can find them, they're highly informative. I can discuss why this concept of shrinking markets isn't talked about more in history books or taught in schools in a future discussion if there's interest. But here's the critical point. The reason Hitler arrived at his shrinking markets concept is because he had a bizarre and completely incorrect understanding of how economics works. Because he didn't understand basic economics, he came to this false and dangerous conclusion. Anyone with a grounding in fundamental economics knows exactly why the shrinking markets idea doesn't work. And if you don't, if you're sitting there thinking you don't understand why the shrinking markets idea is flawed, you're in real danger of going down a dangerous path yourself, or supporting people like Hitler, who claim to understand how things work, but really don't. So if you're not certain why the shrinking markets idea is wrong, or you don't understand why trade benefits everyone involved, you need to educate yourself on basic economics. There are resources available that explain these concepts in a narrative, accessible way without boring number crunching. If you take the time to understand these fundamental economic principles, you won't become the next Hitler. You won't support the next Stalin. Take the time to learn, absorb the concepts, and understand how the world really works.